Soldiers, you could say, were the main actors in the February Revolution. This revolution, like most revolutions, took place not because anyone rose up, but because the forces of the existing order lost the will and the capacity to defend that order. But the process of disengagement from the Tsarist war did not end in February 1917. Soldiers were ripe for Bolshevik propaganda on an immediate end to the war, and the Bolsheviks were clearer and more categorical on this point than any other political grouping, including socialists, in 1917. And it's hard to overstate just how important that was as a factor in their victory. But the Bolshevik diatribes against the imperialist war did not mean that their own new regime was demilitarized. Of course not. This was partly because so many of their supporters in 1917 to 18 were soldiers first, peasants second, and communists only a distant third. But above all, it was because the Bolsheviks would very soon have to remilitarize Russian society for their own existential struggle in the Civil War. This was a disconcerting and in many ways counterintuitive move. Socialism was meant to be against militarism, but here was a socialist regime plunging into armed conflict and total mobilization of society, or at least the parts of society that it had under its control. Universal conscription was reintroduced in 1918, and in the Civil War, the Bolsheviks would mobilize about 5 million men. Only about 1/6 of their total forces were volunteers. And they had to go a long way beyond their core proletarian constituency. At the end of 1920, almost 80% of the 5.5 million Red Army soldiers were peasants. As Sanborn has shown, the Bolshevik system of sticks and carrots for soldiers in wartime continued and completed the post-1905 Tsarist efforts to build a loyal modern army. There was a direct link between soldiering and citizenship. The Bolsheviks inherited this Tsarist mission while the Tsarist regime had lost the confidence of the military professionals that it had the army's best interests at heart. Hence the transfer of allegiance from Tsarism to Bolshevism or some kind of revolutionary regime was quite natural for the 8,000 Tsarist officers who declared their loyalty to the Bolsheviks after the collapse of the provisional government. But that raises a tricky question. Was the party making the military in its image, or was the party itself being taken over by the military, becoming militarized? This was a controversial issue at the time, as many Bolsheviks fretted about the continued employment of non-communist military professionals from the Imperial Army. And what of the post-Civil War era? Should the Red Army then try to create a regular standing army and reinstate normal military hierarchies, or should it aim for something much more radical, like a militia army? What should be the balance between those two models of army? The debate on these matters in the first half of the 1920s was extremely heated, not least because it overlapped to a considerable extent with the main political struggle going on in the party at that time between Trotsky and everyone else. At first glance, the military professionals would seem to have won the argument. One-man command, Yedina Nachalya, was re-established in 1925 with a concomitant downgrading of political commissars. There was a definite trend towards professionalization of the Soviet military in the late 1920s, with a corresponding rise in its sense of self-worth. But actually, this was all happening very much on the party's terms. If the Bolsheviks were willing to let the officer corps do things its own way more of the time, that was because they were confident that the army elite by the mid-1920s had been largely communized. Soviet military schools were starting to turn out more people, so the percentage of communists rose from just under a quarter of officers and just under a fifth of administrative personnel in 1923 to more than 40% of the combined staffs in 1925. And the militarization of Soviet life was harnessed to party objectives: industrialization, which was practically synonymous with militarization in the period of the first five-year plan, and collectivization, effectively war on the village. The military leadership pushed back a little against collectivization in 1930. It was absolutely disastrous for the morale and loyalty of peasant conscripts, but the mobilizatory campaigning ethos that Bolshevism shared with the military had already done much to turn the rural world upside down. But actually, the question of who called the shots, the party or the military, may miss the point about Bolshevism in the 1920s and afterwards. The Bolsheviks were forged as a political unit in the Civil War, and they had the characteristics of a military caste. This became more pronounced with time as infighting grew more bitter. The defeat of the right opposition at the end of the 1920s was in large part the victory of the militarized section of the party leadership over the civilians, Nikolai Bukharin and Alexei Rykov. Then think of the extraordinarily violent and militarized rhetoric of the so-called Cultural Revolution of 1928 to 32. The whole of society in the 1920s was infused with the recent memory and the habits of war. And the relationship between party and army was not, at least not yet, a zero-sum game. Witness industrialization, that I've already mentioned, was in large part militarization. It was directed at the needs of rearmament. You also find a great deal of congruence in worldviews, as Mark von Hagen, amongst others, have pointed out, between the Bolsheviks and the military. The value of discipline, a certain contempt for individualism, for commerce, and for liberalism. In the 1930s, the army's hand was further strengthened by the dangerous international situation, most immediately the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Military training became more firmly institutionalized in Soviet society. But then the Stalinist leadership pointed out the difference between militarization and militarism that would accord weight to the army per se. The Great Terror, as I'm sure you all know, took a very heavy toll of the military command and officer corps. And the irony was that this immensely militarized country was actually rather poorly prepared for World War II when it finally arrived. This was partly a matter of the purge, of the terror, which plunged the military high command into turmoil at just the moment it needed to be drawing conclusions from the early phases of World War II, especially the disastrous Finnish campaign of 1939 to 1940. At the time of the German invasion, the Red Army simply had too few officers, 85% of the number it needed, or 67,000 short of requirements. And it would lose tens of thousands more over the first 6 months of the war. But a more fundamental problem with the Soviet armed forces in 1941 was longer term and structural. Military professionals were better paid at the end of the 1930s than at the beginning of the decade. Titles of rank had been reintroduced in 1935, and the army was better resourced in terms of materiel and weaponry. Military professionalism was taking shape despite the terror. In 1939, a law on universal military service reduced social class criteria, and in combination with a reduction in territorial units in the army, this ostensibly meant that the army could now be a true crucible of a Soviet nation. But military expertise had not developed as fast as it needed to in the 1930s. One problem was that the purge of pre-revolutionary military specialists in the Cultural Revolution had got rid of the available expertise. Another was what Roger Rees has called the civilianization of the armed forces due to the constant transfer of party members into and out of the army. This significantly impeded the creation of a military ethos. So, despite all the material advances of the 1930s, the officer corps was not actually any better trained. Rees has called the Red Army, quote, institutionally incompetent in 1939. And this situation was exacerbated by the terror that tended to spare the Stalin loyalists from the era of the Civil War. In other words, their notions of how to fight a war were anachronistic, rather more to do with cavalry than with tanks. As John Erickson puts it, for almost 2 years, the Soviet Union tried to fight the formidably modern war machine of Germany with a pattern or model of organization drawn from the far-off days of the Civil War, for this was the only one known at the outset to be viable. But what's remarkable is how quickly, given all of these liabilities, the Soviets were able to turn things around. And here's where the militarization of society and economy and the cross-contamination of military and civilian life becomes an asset rather than a weakness. In an important sense, whatever the catastrophic defeats of 1941, the USSR was very well prepared. The military itself might have been in a poor state, but society and the economy were already fully mobilized on a war footing. And with that advantage, the deficiencies in leadership and war production could be made good remarkably quickly. There's an astonishing evacuation effort and an astonishingly fast redirection of the economy at pressing defense needs. And in due course, Soviet industry would be outproducing the Germans in important areas. The war was decided less by inexhaustible supplies of Soviet soldiers and more by tank production. This was combined with a reversion to the principle of one-man command, Единое началье. There was a certain amount of yo-yoing on the question of political commissars and whether they should be used, but they're brought back in 1937, then they're removed in 1940, they come back after the German invasion, and then they're removed again. But for the most part, after the first year of the war, Stalin learns to take advice from the military. But such was the scale of recruitment into the party from the armed forces during World War II that the Soviet leadership in 1945 was confronted with a question familiar from the Civil War. Was the party taking over the army, or was the army taking over the party? What Stalin did was very firmly to keep the military in its place, partly due to fears of Bonapartism, partly to keep up the ideological initiative, and partly out of economic concerns. The Soviet state didn't have the money to provide a generous settlement to war veterans. So provisions for veterans, both material and symbolic, became rather scanty after 1947. There were ideological campaigns to restore the primacy of the party under Zhdanov. And for good measure, Marshal Zhukov was disgraced. From the mid-1950s, after the death of Stalin, relations between party and military were normalized in the sense that there were no more major wars and no more outbreaks of terror. But what can we conclude about the relationship long-term between the party and the military? There was a large Sovietological literature on the question of who had the upper hand. At one end of the spectrum, you had Roman Kolkovich talking about the Soviet military as an interest group, quite able to assert its own distinctive agendas. Other people, such as Timothy Colton, taking a more nuanced view. The main thing is that the model of the zero-sum game again seems inappropriate. The army was quiescent in the second half of the Soviet period, not just because it didn't know any different, but also because it could advance its goals very securely under the leadership of the Communist Party. Yes, Marshal Zhukov, who was brought back into the establishment after Stalin's death, was once again disgraced by Khrushchev in 1957. But overall, the position of the military was improving. In 1955, the armed forces numbered 4.6 million personnel, and of those, almost 20% were officers. An extremely inflated number, which added further to the already growing military lobby, as Roger Rees points out. There's the further point that de-Stalinization is an awful lot, actually, about the war and war memory. It's about reclaiming the memory of World War II from Stalin personally. And to that extent, it represents a symbolic improvement for the military professionals, a boost to them. It's true that Khrushchev was not a great friend to the army because he stood up to the military lobby and announced troop cuts. But the fortunes of the military, both symbolic and material, seemed on a constant upward trajectory when a new general secretary came to power, Brezhnev. There was the basic fact that the political elite was saturated with military experience. 1/3 of Politburo members in 1966 had spent at least 7 years in military or military-related occupations, as Colton points out. The new leadership under Brezhnev had a healthy respect for military expertise and tended to allow senior officers considerable autonomy. Then there was the appointment of Marshal Grechka as the new defense minister in 1967. Okay? And then he was made a member of the Politburo in 1973, only the second defense minister to be elevated in that way after Zhukov briefly in 1956-57. Then there's the fact that the military needs loomed very, very large in the Soviet planned economy. The military-industrial complex was a vast and powerful entity. Perhaps half of the R&D budget was soaked up by this complex. Most important for my purposes tonight, the army continued to pervade society, and it did so on a more secure footing than in the 1930s, with a more elaborate set of institutions. The term of service was reduced to 2 years in 1967, but the rate of induction was quite high, and conscription was supported by a large pre-induction program under DOSAF, the Voluntary Society for Assistance to the Army, Air Force, and Fleet. Under Khrushchev, troop numbers had fallen to a low of 3.6 million in 1960, but they started to rise again in the mid-1960s, and they'd peak only in 1985. Military professionals were treated better by the government than ever before. By the mid-1970s, a lieutenant earned a touch more than the average salary for white and blue-collar workers, and the more senior ranks in the army were correspondingly better paid, and there were generous holiday and pension benefits as well. The armed forces also had a formidable political apparatus, the main political administration. This army branch of the party numbered 30,000 full-time political officers in 1963. As Ellen Jones puts it in her study, they were a cross between propagandists and military chaplains. And probably the numbers rose after that, although we're not entirely sure about that. About 1/5 of military personnel were party members, which was 3 or 4 times the rate in society at large. The political administration seemed to be serving as a very effective conduit between the party and the military, two groups that most of the time enjoyed, in Colton's words, a firm concurrence of practical objectives. They wanted the same things. But here's the paradox as we move into the later stages of the Soviet period. Soviet society still accorded great prominence to war memory and military preparation and the military full stop. But after 1945, it was not fighting any actual wars. There's this strange interlude of peace, peace amid Cold War. This changed with Afghanistan. And with the start of the Afghanistan campaign, it turned out the armed forces were not in such great shape after all. In the late 1940s, in the wake of World War II, the Soviet army had been very cohesive and experienced. By the 1970s, as Rees has shown, the officer corps was starting to stagnate, with the military becoming a self-sustaining caste and levels of recruitment from outside military families in steep decline. It was noticeable that the Soviet military was very top-heavy, with a much higher proportion of officers than, for example, in the US Army. Another important difference from Western armies was the weakness of the NCO Corps. This, along with the 1967 reform of conscription, is often blamed for the prevalence in the Soviet and Russian army of bullying, or dedovshchina. There were also problems at the very top. The relationship between the military and the party top brass began to cool in the mid-1970s. In 1976, Ustinov, a close Brezhnev ally, was appointed the first civilian Minister of Defense since 1955. In 1976, a mini cult of personality developed around Brezhnev's supposed military exploits. This was, of course, annoying to the military elite, as was the apparent retreat from traditional Soviet strategy. First détente, and then Brezhnev's disavowal of strategic superiority in 1977. You might think that the enduring cult of World War II is a countervailing trend. After all, it reaches its zenith in the late 1970s. November 1978 is the time that World War II veterans were finally granted a significant set of benefits and became a distinct status group, as Mark Adler points out in his important study of Soviet veterans. But this privileged treatment of the warriors of the past is not the same as militarization in the present. You could argue that they are almost mutually exclusive. Resources are always scarce, and the decision was taken back in the late 1970s to distribute them for past achievements rather than, or more than, for present feats. There were problems too in the main body of the army, the conscripts. From the late 1960s, a program of basic military training had been extended to compensate for the reduction in terms of service. The conscripts of the post-1967 era were considerably more urban and educated than their predecessors. But this did not necessarily make them more receptive to the hardships of military life, especially when those hardships included bullying and when service took them to Afghanistan. The campaign in Afghanistan very quickly became a disorderly and violent counterinsurgency operation. Although it was not possible to discuss this openly in Soviet society in the early 1980s, it seems clear that the popular mood was turning against the war very soon, and with the rise to power of an extremely civilian General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, in 1985, the scene was set for a very significant pushback against the military. Gorbachev's outlook was, from the beginning, at odds with that of the military establishment. His doctrine of, quote, reasonable sufficiency in arms ripped up the blank check that the party had given the military in the first decade of Brezhnev's rule. Gorbachev's Politburo members had strikingly less military experience than their predecessors of 1966. Gorbachev was clearly more inclined to listen to the Foreign Ministry and the KGB than the army. In due course, Gorbachev began to purge the senior ranks of the army, and in December 1988, he announced the demobilization of 500,000 troops. The troop numbers fell from 5.3 million in 1985 to a little under 4 million in 1990. Worse still, the glasnost of the Gorbachev era turned a harsh spotlight on all the most dysfunctional aspects of the army, Afghanistan and bullying above all. It's little wonder that conscription soon became a nationalist cause in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the Baltic republics. The new Soldiers' Mothers movement, established in the summer of 1989, publicized figures on deaths of soldiers. All this brought a vast increase in draft evasion in the late 1980s and a corresponding decline in the quality of conscripts. In due course, even the Holy of Holies was under attack. World War II, the cult of the cult of World War II. There's a very telling book well, a book with a very telling subtitle published in 1994 by the American scholar Nina Tumarkin on the memory of the war. The subtitle is The Rise and Fall of the Cult of World War II. Amazing to think that someone in 1994 thought that the cult was in decline, but that is exactly how it seemed at that point. Another sign of trouble was that the army was overstepping the strict boundaries between military and civilian life. It was remarkably undisciplined in its public role at the end of the Soviet Union and just after. In the August coup, the military proved leaderless and incapable of action, but a couple of years later, generals and officers were getting more political. This was a sign not of the army's strength, but rather of its weakness. The party's collapse had removed the main organizational structure, and military men were likely to seek to realize their ambitions not in the army, but in civilian politics and indeed the civilian economy. As Dale Herspring puts it of the 1990s, quote, "The average Russian soldier was not certain whom to obey in a crisis, the Duma, the president, or perhaps a retired but highly popular general such as Alexander Lebed." In the mid-1990s, it was common for military officers to run for election and to engage in public criticism of state policy. In the December 1993 parliamentary elections, all but 4 of the 16 parties had officers running on their electoral lists, although only 11 were actually elected. And in 1996, of course, General Lebed ran for president and played a rather significant role in Yeltsin's re-election. All of this is well described in a book by Zoltan Barany. By this time, things had got even worse for the military with the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996. A hasty and botched offensive led to an intractable counterinsurgency war and a truce that felt like and was a defeat. As of 1996, the militarized giant that the USSR had always appeared to be had turned into a demoralized army and a weak polity. As Barany puts it, there is no similar case in world history of a dominant armed force so rapidly and so thoroughly deteriorating without being defeated in battle. Here, as elsewhere, we face a stark question. If things were so disastrous in the mid-1990s, how did Putin turn them around so quickly? And do we, in the early 21st century, have a throwback to the Soviet Union, or is this just a surface similarity? If we turn the clock forward just a few years from the First Chechen War, of course, we find a second Chechen campaign with much more popular backing. We find the government deploying with success a discourse of internal mobilization to meet an external threat. Patriotic education makes a comeback in the 2000s, and the cult of the Great Patriotic War comes roaring back after its decline in the 1990s. The Second Chechen War allowed the Russian state to draw a line, more or less, under the First War and even under Afghanistan, or at least to sanitize and heroize those conflicts. Russia perhaps didn't quite find a place in the pantheon for the protagonists of its counterinsurgency operations, but it did at least manage to show these wars as contributing to a newly robust statehood. The soldiers' mothers, so important in undermining the legitimacy of the military in the late 1980s, early 1990s, on closer inspection, did little to challenge the basic militaristic values of Russian society. Pacifism was still a dirty word. Under Putin, the military achieved much greater public prominence, but to the extent it participated in politics, it did so on the president's terms. And eventually, through Anatoly Serdyukov, after many years of stalled initiatives, the military had to face up to painful reforms in the wake of the South Ossetian War in 2008. Undoubtedly, since then, the Russian army has become better funded, more technologically sophisticated, more mobile and responsive, and better run. But I'm no military analyst, and I'm not exactly sure what this implies for the long term, and for example, whether the high military budgets of recent times are sustainable. What I want to do instead is end with some reflections on the main subject for tonight, which is the relationship between the military and society. Reflections that suggest that not quite as much has changed as we might think. It was said by a number of observers in the post-Soviet period that the Russian military had become a, quote, worker-peasant army again, like in the 1920s. But the difference is that peasants are now a small proportion of the population rather than a large majority, and military service is not the same channel of upward mobility. By 2004, only about 10% of young men of recruitment age could be drafted, as compared with about 50% of young men who were serving in the Brezhnev era. The recruitment pool, even after the military reforms of 2008, is still of poor quality, and it's dwindling. So where are all these soldiers, and in particular professional soldiers, going to come from? If we look beyond the army itself, however, we find that ambient levels of violence, both real and symbolic, remain high in Russian society. And this is the subject of an interesting research project done by Jan Behrens in Potsdam at the moment. Jan Behrens is interested in the long continuities stretching from Afghanistan in the 1980s to recent developments in the Donbass. As Behrens argues, scholars have been inclined to remark on the surprising absence of violence in the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 and just after, but have been rather less attentive to the many residues of violent practices in post-Soviet societies. A small clue came in the riots at the Football European Championships in France last summer. Russian hooligans stood out from their English counterparts, for example, for their almost paramilitary style of organization. It seemed to me, looking on, that this was a kind of hooliganism that could only arise in a society with mass conscription. There's a degree of overlap between the quasi-military Russian violence and the hooligan violence that you find elsewhere in the world that arises from late industrial anomie. But the Russian example seemed to suggest a more intimate and sustained experience of violence than, say, English thugs could muster. Our English hooligans are already half a century on from conscription and colonial wars. We also need to remember a domestic Russian legacy of Soviet-era violence, the 1990s. Back in the 1990s, it was plausible to think of Russian society as a set of nested protection rackets. People moved back freely back and forth between uniformed positions to forms of what Vadim Volkov called violent entrepreneurship. To use a molecular image, violence was a free radical in Russian society. Okay, so it moved out of the army proper into all kinds of other arenas. But NB, all of this does not make present-day Russia militarized in the sense of the Soviet era. Don't be misled. Russian society is not ready for sacrifice. There's still a great unwillingness to serve in the armed forces, and the cult of World War II actually keeps that conflict, the conflict of the 1940s, at a safe and sanitized distance. There's a lot of support for military at the symbolic level, but this does not correlate with readiness for personal sacrifice. So what I would say is that if Soviet Russia under Stalin was militarized without being militaristic, in today's Russia it's the reverse that is closer to being the case. To quote David Stone in his important work on industrialization and militarization, hammer and rifle, militarization is, quote, less a thing than a process involving the organization of society for violence. The ultimate result is a society organized for war and lacking clear boundaries between military and civil life, end of quotation. While Russian society does have violence, it lacks organization, and the boundaries between military and civil life are much firmer than they were even in the 1970s, let alone in the 1920s. So what can we say about the overall trajectory since 1917? The revolution and civil war left the political system and the military completely intertwined. But this was never a relationship between equals. The leading role of the party was asserted violently under Stalin, and less violently, but perhaps even more effectively, under Gorbachev. And most other times, the political leadership and the military achieved a mutually beneficial working relationship under overall party hegemony. But party hegemony ended in 1990, and Putin and United Russia are not quite an adequate replacement. Military symbols and practices are much more prominent in Russian society than in Western liberal democracies. Violence, both real and symbolic, is more extreme than in Western democracies, as colonial and post-colonial conflicts, above all in Afghanistan and Chechnya, leave their traces. But while Russia might have the form of militarization, it does not have the content. This is not a society mobilized for self-defense, whether against internal or external enemies. What this implies for the future of state-society relations in Russia is another matter. I think I've done enough, had enough on my plate talking about the last 100 years. But if anyone wants to engage in speculation in the questions, you're welcome. Okay, thank you very much.
So now questions. Who wants to? Okay, I will start then, and then. Ah.
There was one back there.
Yeah.
Shall we start back there? Yes, of course. No, should I do that?
Good evening. I maybe have not understood, and I maybe didn't understand that clearly, but you talked about the percentage of Russian people serving in the army, and said it was about 4%. Is it right, or am I mistaken about?
No. I think it was. I think probably one of the figures was about 10% of the recruitment pool. So of the men of young men of recruitment age in 2004, which is much lower than in the Soviet period.
Yeah. Okay, but that seems. I mean, I don't doubt that might be right, but I know that in Russian it's binding to serve the army. So how could it be that the figure is so low?
Well, there are a large number of medical exemptions and deferments, for educational reasons and others. There was also, again, it's really hard to know hard facts about this, but it was well known that, especially in the 1990s, there was a high level of corruption, and people bought their way out of military service. Now, other people in this room may have better information, but I remember being told that it cost about $5,000 to do that, which of course goes back to what I said about the class profile of the army. It's generally the better off. Young men from better off families who are able to avoid service. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I have two short questions. One, has the Ministry of Defense of Russia or its equivalent, to your knowledge, been headed by a military person, or do we have any shift between a civil person, so somebody who is not a general or an officer, and somebody who is an officer? Because I think this would make a difference in corroborating or defying. So, because you made this difference militaristic without being militarized, or the other way around, right? So, I mean, it would be my first question. So whether we have breaks or continuities in that respect, with respect to the person of the Minister of Defense or the Commissar of War, whatever. And I mean, the second aspect, because you made some very interesting inferences about the post-Soviet period. I mean, we have been observing wars, I mean, between, I mean, and all this is related to this to the narrative of the Great Patriotic War. I mean, the Red Army was a multi-ethnic army with people that had the same training, but were coming from different republics, different ethnic, national origins. So, I mean, when we have this Karabakh war, where you have Azeri and Armenian officers giving orders to their soldiers to kill each other, and they had the same training, they studied in the same military schools, the same holds for the Transnistria conflict, the same holds for the Georgian-Russian war, so the same holds for Ukrainian generals dealing with Russian paramilitary or, in eastern Ukraine. So, I mean, you have people that basically studied in the same military academies, most likely in the 70s or even the 80s, or the 80s most likely, the ones that are giving the orders. So, I mean, when you have these new post-Soviet armies fighting each other, how can we still, I mean, how is this narrative of the Great Patriotic War being resolved or recaptured or redefined? Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely, on the first question, you're absolutely right. The question of, a simple question of who is the Minister of Defence, civilian or military, is an important indicator of what way the relationship is going. And, you know, I won't take you through the full story, but there are important moments in the story, such as the moment when Stalin imposes a civilian in I think it's 1946, Bulgarin. Then there's the comeback that I mentioned of the professional military men. So in the Brezhnev period. Briefly in the Khrushchev period with Zhukov, but then he falls from grace again. And then under Putin, there's a move towards civilian again, imposing something on the military. You know, I haven't been following things in any great detail very recently, but it seems that possibly there's a military lobby beginning to assert itself again now, so the balance might have shifted one more time, perhaps since 2012, 2013. But it's kind of hard to know without studying it more carefully. But you're absolutely right. It does tilt. You know, it tilts this way and that. Nationalities in the post-Soviet armies. Yeah, of course. Here's where memories clash, don't they? Because on the one hand, as a good Soviet patriot trained in the academies in the 70s, you have one view of World War II. As a Chechen or an Estonian, or of course, you have a very different view. What is interesting is that a lot of these Soviet-trained military people are able to make the switch into the currency of nationalism. I think the most striking example is Dudayev in Chechnya, who knew what he knew about nationalism, not from Chechnya but from the Baltic republics, having I think been stationed there before. Okay, but this is happening all the time. It's the same sort of changing of currency is happening in the political elite at this time. So these are people who've worked their way up the party structures, who you think have a huge investment in the Soviet party state. But when that Soviet party state starts sinking, they realize, nationalism is the way to go. The military is similar. Of course, another point is that every nationality has its own particular relationship to the Soviet military past and to World War II in particular. Okay, so you know, an Armenian would have a different view from an Azerbaijani, but of course Chechen would have a completely different, you know, a completely different view.
Is it on? Yes. Thank you very much for your speech. My question is concerning, it's a bit off topic, is concerning your methodology, because you know you were talking in the beginning about data that was you know, data on military in the 80s, in the 70s, and you know, the Soviet Union was one, like, externally and also internally closed society, which means that, like, data is not so easy to gather. The sociology was not so open as it is nowadays. So I can imagine that, first of all, that data was to gather data back then was very difficult and was made only by statesmen that had you know, like they were open to classified information in a way, right? And even though that 25 years have, or even more, have passed since then, I can still imagine that the Russian state could keep some of those data, you know, closed. So my question is, how do you proceed? Do you go to some archives? Do you take documents? Do you read some journals, some texts written by Russians? How can you assure, for instance, me, like when I do a homework or home paper, that this data is trustworthy? Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah, well, first qualification is that I haven't myself done detailed research on this on this topic, but from what I have written, it's clear that there are a number of ways around this. So the first thing is that published sources are actually quite useful and quite well. First of all, they're voluminous. There's a lot of, you know, a lot in the military press. I mean, if you read what I think is still the best, you know, general treatment of the military party relationship, and that's Colton's book, Timothy Colton's book from 1979. He worked from newspapers, and he was, you know, there's a real sense when you read that he's been careful, and he tells you when he's not sure about something, and he tells you when, I mean, data is not available. So yeah, there's a surprising amount you can get from reading the old, as it were, the old literature, the literature written before the fall of the Soviet Union, and actually, I get the feeling that things have not moved on that much in our understanding of these matters since then. Partly because archival access is poor for the very late period generally, and I think it's especially likely to be poor in matters that have any kind of bearing on state security, such as the military. But I do think it would be a wonderful project for someone, possibly someone in this room, to do a real kind of, you know, a proper social history of the army in the, for example, since the '67 reform. You know, exactly what kind of an army was this, and what was its relationship to society? We still don't quite have that. The equivalent for the early Soviet period, which is a kind of really fine. Well, there's the Sanborn book, but the Mark von Hagen book, Soldiers in the Proletarian Dictatorship, which was written a long time ago. I mean, it was sometime, I think it came out in the '80s. Is a very fine study based an awful lot on, I mean, not exclusively, but a lot on published sources. So, but yeah, precisely because as historians as a breed are not a terribly military bunch unless they are actual military historians. If you see what I mean, they don't have much of a military sensibility. I do feel that you know, social historians tend to slightly overlook the very obvious point that this is a very militarized society where a very large number of people go through military service, and this has to matter for our understanding. Now, how exactly it matters is another question. you should get Jan Behrens to come down the road from Potsdam to tell you about that. Yeah, yeah. Yep.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions, one rather historical. You didn't really touch the controversy about Trotsky of the 1920s, but if I remember right, he was also labeled a Bonapartist, and the discussion about a possible militarization of the revolution played an important role in the 1920s. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that. And the second question touches a little bit on questions of memory. I remember that in Germany, there was a quite broad discourse about the good Wehrmacht and the bad regime. So there was a kind of tendency of whitewashing the role of the military in supporting a totalitarian/authoritarian regime. And I wanted to ask you how you assess this kind of discourse in Russia since the 1990s, because I remember that there was a strong discourse in the early 1990s where this kind of tendency was transmitted on a rather broad scale, and I was asking you how this is assessed in Russia nowadays and during the last 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think you're right that Bonapartism was one of the things thrown at Trotsky. Generally, the Russian revolution, the Bolsheviks, were, of course, acutely aware of parallels with 1789 and, of course, the Paris Commune. They studied their history books, or at least selectively studied their history books, and they knew what they wanted to avoid. So on the one hand, Bonaparte might be an inspiring example in the sense that turning revolution into revolutionary war, for example, in war to take the revolution west was an appealing possibility for a brief moment. But yeah, when socialism in one country becomes the policy, then Bonapartism becomes a danger much more than a possibility. There's a lot more. I mean, there are many reasons why Trotsky is defeated, I think, but that's in the mix for sure in the 20s. That's a very interesting point about the parallel, possible parallel with the German discourse on the Wehrmacht. I think that, of course, one needs to make the qualification that Russian memory culture has gone a lot less far than German memory culture. I mean, there's just a huge difference in the extent to which the Russians have acknowledged some of the dark, the dark sides of their history. So in a sense, there isn't there isn't so much of a problem because the solution has been really just to try and forget about what happened before 1941. Of course, not completely. I mean, a lot has been said. A lot did come out, but just not to talk about it too much, and to focus on 1941 onwards. The problem was with memory. Was not so much the dark sides of World War II, of course, although they exist on the Soviet side, as we know full well, because they were completely taboo. I think. I mean, I think it's fair to say it's just taboo to talk about any kind of Red Army atrocities. But it's Afghanistan. It's Afghanistan and Chechnya. This was the really difficult. These were the difficult wars to accommodate in recent Russian memory, and it seems to have been done by now. Partly, I mean, if you look at the films, there's a big difference between the films on Afghanistan of the 1990s and those of the 2000s. Wasn't there? I've forgotten the details, but there's some kind of site on Paklonna Gora, isn't there, now allocated, the main memorial complex in Western Moscow, that is devoted to Afghanistan. I believe. Although I can't remember the details.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm really fascinated by this distinction between militarized and militaristic.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about how the militarization of Soviet society filtered through to the kind of non-military civilian part of society, and you define this militarization as people being ready for sacrifice. But we know that, for example, I suppose the question is, why is it that people become ready for sacrifice, and how do you know the Soviet Union didn't really go to war everywhere like, say, the US did in the post-war period? So is it, say, the pioneer movement? Is it, military? Is it a kind of pseudo-military educational discipline in the schoolroom, and so on? And the second question about the post-Soviet era, you say it becomes militaristic without any more being militarized. Is there a kind of causal link? Because we know, for example, that there are documentaries about gang cultures which are paramilitary in nature. We know that there are military reenactment groups who actually send people to the war in Crimea. So there's a kind of informal movement to become militarized, but without that state backing officially. So is there a causal link between the demilitarization of the state in post-Soviet Russia and this becoming more militaristic? Is it because is it because they don't have that discipline anymore, in official institutions, that they go out and become more kind of rough?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, I did it imply in something that I said towards the end. Yes, that militarization equaled readiness to sacrifice. I don't think that was the best formulation. And really, what I was getting at earlier on, certainly early on in the Soviet period, following Sanborn, militarization is not so much willingness to sacrifice; it's willingness to fight and to kill, in some greater cause and in a reasonably sort of disciplined fashion. And then sacrifice may be, the concomitant of that. You may end up having to sacrifice yourself, but that isn't the primary, the primary impulse. But you asked how does this filter through? How does this affect Soviet society? I think it's I mean, the thing that I noticed above all is language and rhetoric. So it's the way that people talk about their world, the metaphor of conflict, the metaphor of the front, a certain kind of rather combative collectivism. Yeah, I mean, these are the sort of soft, intangible ways that it happens. But then, of course, there's all sorts of military training going on for civilians and ceremonies and processions and so on. But I think in the Soviet period, it's a whole way of seeing. It's almost a whole way of seeing the world. How significant this is ultimately, and to what extent it transforms people's view of the world, is another matter. I think that there's something in the argument that soldiers in combat situations, however different the soldiers are in their training and in their origins, they're always the same. It's always the small group. It's the small group loyalty that is primary, and of course trying to save your skin. Yes, this question, the interesting question of the demilitarization and militarism. Yeah, so just to clarify what I would understand as the distinction. So militarization is this kind of instilling of an active, combative, kind of disciplined orientation in society. Militarism is really just a cult of the army as bearer of strength, state strength. There isn't, of course, a clean break between them, and I think the militarization of the Soviet period leaves all kinds of traces. And I mean, I used the sort of the metaphor of the free radical. I mean, there's a lot of violence out there, and the rhetoric of combat in small groups, in collectives, according to some notion of discipline, was retained, but just not in the military so much. And so if you look at, you mentioned gang warfare, but the thing that I always think of is the so-called mafia, organized crime of the 1990s, as described by Vadim Volkov in his excellent book, where he says, okay, certain kinds of functions, certain kinds of state functions have to be performed, whether or not the state is capable of performing them. Okay, so if the state isn't able to enforce contracts, then someone else will do it. But what's interesting about the Soviet case is a lot of the actual people doing this enforcing are precisely the people who were wearing uniforms, 2 years before, or in the police force. And then when the state becomes more robust again, and salaries improve for the police force, then they go back into uniform. Okay, so yes, there's that sort of there is that still that interaction. But my sense is that as I said at some point, although there's plenty of violence, out there, there isn't very much organisation, which is a prerequisite for militarization, I think, at some level. Some concept of a collective imposing its rules on you and acting as the channel for this violence.
At one point you were talking about controversies about whether to employ political commissioners in the Red Army or not. I am interested in what was their task in the Red Army, the political commissioners, commissars, right? And what was the reason for this controversies? Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So it all began during the Civil War, when, as I mentioned, there were 8,000 or so Tsarist officers who switched sides to the Bolsheviks, which was on one level great news for the Bolsheviks to have all of that know-how. On the other hand, extremely worrying, because how could you be sure of the loyalty of these people? So solution to that is the institution of political commissars, who are really kind of standing on the shoulder, standing over the shoulder of these military commanders, and understand their role to be just as important as that of the military commander during the Civil War. So there's a kind of there's a tension, tug of war between the two. When the Civil War is over, in the early 20s, there's a big debate on what do we do now. The military says, we've won the Civil War now. We've proved ourselves. We want now to build up a big peacetime army. We can't continue with this model of exceptional mobilization that we've had. And so they kind of win the army, the argument, as I say, in the mid-20s, and they shake off the commissars. But by this stage, there's enough of a communist officer corps to make it possible for that to happen. So the reliability of the officer corps can be guaranteed in a way that it couldn't be in 1918 or 1919. Then in 1937, commissars come back, which is of course the time when Stalin is purging purging the military. Okay, so it's a big signal that party supervision is back. Then after, I think the reason is just the fiasco of the Winter War with Finland in 1939-40. Commissars are removed later in 1940. They're brought back after the German invasion in within weeks, I think, of June the 22nd, 1941, and then they're removed again. Okay, so it goes this way and that. What do? They spread political propaganda. Yeah, so they make sure that the troops have, later in the Soviet period, they have a certain number of hours per week of military, of political indoctrination. They serve as, I think, useful adjuncts to the military commanders who can't do everything on their own. They don't have the time to sort of micromanage the life of the individual unit. So the military officers do a lot of this stuff. They try and attend to morale. That sort of, and of course they are ultimately able to report a problem that they see to someone outside the military hierarchy. Okay, so they do act as a sort of, although the evidence seems to be that they very rarely exercise this prerogative, because actually in the later Soviet period, because actually by the late 1960s, 1970s, the military professionals and the political officers, as they're called, they're really the same kind of people. They get on well. They see the world in the same way. There's no particular reason for them to fall out. Yeah. So that's more or less the trajectory of the relationship.